Okay, so hello everyone. Thanks for joining us today, whether you're online, on Zoom, or in person at the Italian Pavilion in Venice. I'm Flora. I'm the creative director of Ideal Spaces Working Group, and I'm joined by Ulrich Giemann, who's the founder and director of Ideal Spaces. And today we'll be hosting our workshop on community and concepts of resilience. So before Ulrich and I introduce ourselves and tell you a bit more about the workshop itself, I'd like to tell you about the work of Ideal Spaces. So we're a multinational research group. We are made up of members who work across many different fields, architecture, engineering, 3D design, programming, and cultural theory, just to name a few. And despite our different interests, our members share one main research focus, and that's the relationship between community, space, and place. So at Ideal Spaces, we champion ideal spaces for communities. Ideal in the sense of the visions people have of an improved or ideal world, and then in a more literal sense of how the built and natural environment can best support our lives and our needs, and especially in the face of the problems, global problems we are currently experiencing today with climate change, pandemics, and so on. We really firmly believe that without ideal spaces to live, the true value and essence of what a community is can become lost. And through our podcasts, exhibitions, events, workshops like today's, we really aim to discuss these themes with audiences and share our expertise on utopian and real spaces for forward-thinking communities. So a bit about us then. I'm Flora. I have a background in history of art. I studied in London at the Courtauld Institute, and I'm currently working at the Department for Digital Culture, Media and Sport in London as a heritage advisor. So I joined Ideal Spaces back in 2019, and I've become in charge of the communications, marketing, and last year I launched our new podcast series, the Ideal Spaces podcast, which I co-host along with Ulrich. So I'll hand over then to Ulrich to introduce himself and also our workshop today on resilient communities.
My name is Ulrich Giemann. I'm the director of Ideal Spaces. I've founded Ideal Spaces Working Group in 2016, which means we are a quite young group. My background has been from evolutionary biology and then in business administration. I worked in industry for several years and in government consultancy afterwards. And I was also active in history and as a lectureship also at university in organizational dynamics. And Ideal Spaces was an idea to really integrate the experiences I made so far, to focus them in an expression of a mixture between architecture and art, combined with the history of ideas underlying architecture as a symbolic expression of certain ideas. What these ideas mean expressed as space. It's very short about the Ideal Spaces background as regards my personal view and my incoming into Ideal Spaces. Today we are dealing with community and concepts of resilience, and the main issue from our side is to concentrate not on the mainstream aspects of resilience, as not only on climate change, on technology and issues like that, but to look also at the background of the very notion of resilience itself. As an idea, what resilience means and how resilience relates to certain ideas and let's call them leading basic assumptions of our cultural spheres, of our Occidental heritage, and how it came all about with resilience. We have as a topic one, notions of resilience. There are many, I will treat them very shortly. We have today as a topic 2, the relation between resilience, community, and utopia. We have resilience and the relation to community and architecture, how architecture expresses the thought, the idea of community in terms of resilience. We have a topic 4, large-scale systems, resilience and technology. And so this is more in the direction of the mainstream aspects of resilience. And last but not least, we have topic 5. These are creative communities and the future of the idea of resilience. As regards the notion of resilience, they have one point in common. Resilience is the attempt to adapt to a viable state after incurrence of some threats, very general. The threats and disturbances of a system, either from the outside or from the inside the systems. And there are different degrees of resilience. The most basic degree is to come back to a former state after a disturbance happened. And then are more adaptive other terms of resilience, how to widen the array of possible answers of the system as regards unforeseen threats. So these are the major concepts of resilience so far. We want to concentrate also on another aspect of resilience. We called it systemic resilience. And the point is about systemic resilience. Okay. Systemic resilience means a system's architecture gains momentum, is able to withstand any disturbances from within or from outside the system. An example is the recent neoliberal capitalist, I call it ecosystem as a whole, which gains a momentum of its own, and all aspects of resilient communities have to be located inside this entire ecosystem of a neoliberal context, which is globalized meanwhile. Which means we have to consider this specific kind of resilience as the existing environmental resilience, the social, cultural, and socio-economic environment we are all living in. We have to consider it as a specific kind of resilience, very important when we are speaking about resilient communities and as an utopian approach, in the end, how to establish resilient communities in the future with the implicit or explicit aim for ensuring a better life for human beings. This is a very important aspect, systemic resilience, we will tackle in our first presentation to come. So far, the overview.
Great, yeah, thank you. Before we get started with our first presentation, I just wanted to give a few housekeeping notes for our Zoom participants. I've been told it's really important you make sure you're on Zoom, of course you're on Zoom, on mute throughout the event. So if you have any questions relating to the presentations, please do either post them in the chat or just save them for the discussion sessions, which will take place after each presentation. In your workshop guide, which I believe you were sent this morning, you'll find the agenda for our workshop. I'll just go back to that briefly. And you'll also find the bios of all our speakers. We've got a really jam-packed schedule for you today from experts in their fields. We'll be joined by architects, academics, urban planners who will be sharing their perspectives on resilience. And in case you do have any technical problems today, please do contact our colleague Andy via the chat function. So Andy will be on Zoom throughout the event today and will be really happy to help with any questions you have. So as Ulrich mentioned, our workshop is structured into those 5 main topic areas. I think resilience is a real buzzword that we hear so often in many different contexts in the media, but Usually it relates to how people withstand pressures brought about by disruptive forces around them. And as Ulrich mentioned, we'll be going a lot deeper today to really try and understand a bit more about what resilience is and the kind of concepts and principles underpinning it. So I would like to hand over again to Ulrich and Michael, who will be joining us live on Zoom. Michael is an artist and associate professor in digital media at Kristianstad University in Sweden. He leads on digital development at Ideal Spaces, and he has a particular focus on scenario writing, digital prototyping, and also creating mixed reality spaces. So I'll hand over to you two to continue talking about notions of resilience and systemic resilience, our first topic area. Michael, if you want to share your screen, I believe if you want to continue.
Yes,
right? Right.
Yes.
I'll just stop sharing mine. Hang on.
So can you all see my screen here? Okay.
Yeah, that looks great.
So I work in the design department at my university, and a couple of years ago I started to interest myself in the area of computational imagination, and therefore my start here will be to look upon resilience, imagination, and foresight. Resilience refers to the ability not only to withstand and cope with challenges, but also to transform. Resilience should not be seen as something only reactive. To balance that, we need both imagination and foresight, so that we can sustain required operation under both expected and unexpected conditions. It is hard to know beforehand what knowledge will be relevant for developing a solution whose existence is emergent. From the perspective of imagination, however, the question is not so much how to gain information from the outer world, but rather what kind of knowledge is present in our consciousness and how it is employed and transformed there. This pushes the relationship of known versus unknown in another direction. As I see it, there is a new need to support more lateral ways of thinking about future spaces and our living environments in general. In doing so, to better prepare ourselves for the twists and turns of everyday life and for the challenges we might collectively face in the future. Collective action is not simply a relational social identity building activity. It will require us to create a dialogue between the world as it is and the world what if. The human imagination is an emancipating force that influences not only the singular human mind, but also how all human meaning is experienced and comprehended. A notion of social imagination develops. This basic notion that not only does the world of physical and tangible things matter, but so too, and even more so, do individual and collective aspiration, conceptions, and principle of meaning organization. So that's a bit about the imaginative part. And now we've come to looking ahead. Foresight is the discipline of exploring, anticipating, and shaping the future. Helps build and use collective intelligence and structured and systemic way to anticipate developments and better prepare for change. This occurs because when we mentally compare a desired future with the present, we realize that the present stands in the way of the future, which leads us to understand that something needs to be changed and that we need to take action. But to involve others into these kind of processes, we need to make it clear they are plausible and that they are not utopias. Contrasting a desired future with the present reality makes us more motivated than when we either think about the present or fantasize about the desired future separately. So these are some of the things I want us to consider and think about during our session today. So I hand over to you again, Flora and Ulrich.
Leading straight forward to aspects not normally treated when we are speaking about resilience. First of all, in my eyes, important is the relation between resilience and imagination, and related to imagination, the relation between resilience and foresight. Resilience is not just a systemic formal issue in that sense that a system, no matter which one, a community, a city, whatever, that a system is increasing its adaptive capabilities. This is a very technical view. Resilience in this way is a reactive moment. And what Michael opened up is the perspective of a not only reactive property of resilience related to imagination. In order to become resilient, first of all, as a community, means as a concrete combination of concrete human beings, we have to install our imaginative capabilities, how a future shall look like. We want to become resilient in order to reach that future. That's a very important point, also related to foresight.
And we'll be coming back to kind of concepts relating to the imagination later on in the workshop. But for now, I think the best place to start is with exploring why exactly communities need to build resilience in the first place. And I'm delighted to welcome our first speaker, Khalid Kadir. I don't know if he's online. I'm not sure if he is.
I am here.
Oh, brilliant. Great. I know we're a little bit ahead of schedule, but yeah, thank you for joining us. So I'm going to tell you a bit more about Khalid before I hand over to him to share his screen. He's a continuing lecturer at UC Berkeley and teaches courses in the Global Poverty and Practice Program, Political Economy and Civil and Environmental Engineering. After completing his PhD in environmental engineering at UC Berkeley, Khalid focused his research on the complex role that engineering expertise plays in the politics of international development and poverty alleviation. And his current work focuses on the intersection of poverty, expertise, and politics. So I will hand over to you. So thank you very much for joining us. I know it's late with you in California, but yes, thank you so much.
There we go. Is the sound working now?
Yeah, it's great. Thank you.
All right. And you can see my screen, I assume?
See that? Yeah.
Good deal. Hey, thank you for having me today. Or tonight, I guess, as I'm calling in from California. I'm excited to be here. And I'm excited because of the ways in which my conversations with Ulrich and Flora have pushed me to think about my own work a little bit differently. And I don't traditionally speak on issues of resilience. I think about them. We all are, as Flora mentioned, bombarded with these in the press constantly. But I generally spend my time thinking about the ways in which experts frame problems, view problems, attempt to solve problems, and the challenges between that and actually solving problems. And I think it struck me in my conversations with Ulrich and Flora that there's perhaps some of this happening in the world of resilience too. So what I want to talk about today is something that we might call resilience politics. And to get a little more descriptive, I want to think about the kind of anti-politics that we swim in right now. And then towards the end, I want to think about some ways in which we might politicize our work and think about resilience as not just a technical concept, but actually think about resilience as a political commitment or a political concept that requires us to think differently about what it is and what it isn't. So to begin with, two quotes that are perhaps self-explanatory. The first from journalist George Monbiot: when someone says they have no politics, it means that their politics align with the status quo. He goes on, none of us are unbiased, none removed from the question of power. We are social creatures who absorb the outlook and opinions of those with whom we associate and unconsciously echo them. Even says objectivity is impossible. And then the second from American historian Howard Zinn: you can't stand still on the moving train. Same thing, perhaps said differently. And I start with these in case anyone is still wrapped up in the idea that we can have thoughts, beliefs, and opinions that are somehow objective and removed from our social context, to say that I'm starting with the opposite idea. That our ideas, our beliefs, our perspectives are all rooted in our political positions. And it's hard for us to get around that. And perhaps instead of getting around that, we can embrace that and think about the politics of our work. So a quick outline of what I'm going to cover in the next 30 or so minutes, perhaps a little less. I want to think about the sort of anti-politics of economy. And from there, we'll switch to thinking about technology and the ways in which technology has a sort of anti-politics. And to do that, for the first one, for economy, I'll lean heavily on the work of other thinkers, which I'll share how they come to understand sort of economy as a way of hiding politics in our conversations. And I'll think about the implications for us. And then for politics, I'll walk us through a case of thinking about smart cities and all of this sort of utopic push to build a smart city that will sort of solve all of our problems for us. It will be smarter than us, so to speak. And then wrap it up with a few conclusions. So when I think about the economy, here I'm leaning heavily on the work of Timothy Mitchell, and I'm putting the birthday of the economy at sometime in 1936. It's because, as Mitchell points out, that the national economy appeared as a new discursive object, a new thing that we talk about in the 1930s. Before the 1930s, the term the economy did not exist in the English language. People spoke of political economy or national economy, referring to the economy or the governance of the affairs of a nation. You could also speak of household economy, the management of household resources. Key here is that economy was a practice, not a thing. It meant the efficient management of scarce resources. It wasn't a thing itself to be managed. Previously, economy was a process that was about people, resources, community affairs, focused on structures of production and exchange. It was, we might say, political economy. It was the economy of the polity. It was not the politics of the economy. With this new discursive object, with the creation of this thing called the economy, a thing itself to be managed and manipulated, a certain kind of expertise evolves that has new power in society. The experts who have positioned themselves to name, describe, and manage this new object have therefore placed themselves in positions of power. The economy becomes an object that is understood by measuring and managing the circulation of money. Today, if you take an economics class, you are taking a class that is all about money. Money is, of course, seen as a proxy for the value of other things, but the focus within contemporary economic practice is to look at money circulation and how money moves around. Even the way we understand the wealth of a nation today is by looking at GDP. GDP is nothing more than the net sum of monetary transactions. So when John Maynard Keynes introduced this idea of the economy, he more or less gave birth to the entire discipline of macroeconomics. He devised new ways to describe and manage the domestic circulation of money, but more fundamentally, what he did was make an act of power. He removed certain things from discourse and entered new things into discourse. Sorry, I'm not keeping up with my own slides. In this moment, economic expertise renders the realm of the economy to the people who can set limits on the discourse, who can explain what is and isn't possible. If economic reasoning makes that a possible solution, then maybe we can talk about doing it. But if that's outside of economic reasoning, then we can no longer talk and think about that. The second sort of key thing that happens here is when Keynes birthed the idea of the economy, he birthed the idea of this object that can grow without limits. We think about economies as always needing to grow at 3% per year. And Keynes sort of developed this as a way of dealing with the problem of unemployment and the problem of poverty. This then leaves us to believe that economic growth can occur without taking away from others. So in this process, power is hidden. How people gain wealth, how people gain greater material goods is seen as something that can just sort of happen automatically. It doesn't require extracting from or taking from others. Of course, a little bit of brief history of the world will show the ways in which we've engaged in practice of extraction over and over and over again, and that this wealth must come from somewhere. But the discourse around the economy sort of pretends as though that's not possible. Then in the 1970s, this changes up quite a bit. In the 1970s, this idea of markets takes hold. And here I'm building off the work of both Mitchell and Greta Krippner. In the 1970s, there were a number of crises happening, economic and political. We see the rise of the environment as a thing that people are concerned about. There are energy crises, the numerous oil crises in 73, and then again in 78 and 79. The US dollar is disconnected from gold, and the entire international financial architecture sort of collapses in that moment. There's a major decline in manufacturing. Conflicts in the Middle East are rising up. In this moment, markets are put forward as an alternative to the messiness of democracy. The rising oil prices in the 70s undermined the sort of Keynesian management of domestic economic affairs, and markets then replaced public regulation with private regulation that happens through markets. What I'm saying here is instead of democratically battling over how to manage the different crises in the 70s, particularly here in the United States, when the US was spending far more money than it could afford to, in part related to the war in Vietnam, instead of democratically battling over how to manage the decreased prosperity with explicit winners and explicit losers, the market is presented as a way to avoid such messy democratic struggles. Markets are looked to as a way of avoiding the messiness of political decision-making. Instead of politicians playing a role in deciding who is going to have access to wealth and who is going to be rendered poverty, this messiness that loses one votes is left to, well, markets decide. And it's up to you as an actor in markets to determine your own fate. This is sort of hiding behind an ideology of market efficiency as a way to justify social degradation. Market devices, Timothy Mitchell writes, were intended as an alternative to democratic methods of governing matters of public concern by converting them into matters of private regulation by those with the resources to operate as market agents. Greta Krippner goes even further and says that in this process, distributional conflicts were effectively depoliticized under market-like rule. It's not about somebody making you poor. This is just how markets work. Some are winners, some are losers. And if you want to be a winner, you better move differently through the world and through society. As a result of this, Krippner warns us, states are now weaker to the extent that nation states turn to markets to deal with these sorts of conflicts, to the extent that nation states attempted to avoid the messiness of political decision-making and instead left governance through market devices. The state now lacks public support and public confidence for action. How much do we want to spend and for whom is a deeply political question, one which markets cannot resolve. Scholar Wendy Brown goes even further. She argues that with the rise of markets and with the rise of neoliberalism, we have actually seen the destruction of the person she calls homo politicus. Homo politicus for Brown is the person who is fundamentally concerned with politics, including, she writes, deliberation, belonging, aspirational sovereignty, concern with the common, and with one's relation to justice in the common. She goes on, Homo politicus is animated by and for the realization of popular sovereignty, as well as its individual sovereignty. The creature who, she writes, made the French and American revolutions and whom the American Constitution bears forth. She describes Homo politicus as the person that as the sovereign individual who governs themselves, who puts limits upon themselves. For Wendy Brown, the rise of neoliberalism and the triumph of this rational economic man is undermining democracy. And in fact, it is destroying our own individual abilities to engage in political discourse, in political conversation. And it is destroying as well our ability to govern ourselves through our own moral autonomy. She writes, the argument is that economic values have not simply supersaturated the political. It's not just that we think about economics more than we think about politics. Instead, it's that a neoliberal iteration of Homo economicus has destroyed, as she writes, extinguished the agent and the domains through which democracy materializes. What the threads I'm trying to pull together here is that the 20th century and the 21st century our logic of governance through economics and then later through neoliberalism have steadily undermined our ability to work through political processes. It's made it harder for us to deliberate and work across difference and engage with one another, which then undermines our ability to create a resilient future. To the extent that we are locked in battles against, as opposed to working forward together, it makes it very hard to think about resilience. Instead, we are too focused thinking about victory and conquest. This takes another angle when we turn to the problem of technology. And I want to take a little bit of a side trip here to think about technology. And I want to think about a specific iteration of utopian thinking that surrounds us today. And I want to consider this idea of smart cities. They're utopian dreams, and to do so in the context of resilience and in the context of the hidden politics that underlie such seductive topics. Now, I'm not going to do some complete total analysis of smart cities. I'm not going to look at a specific city and unpack it. I'm also not going to provide us with an instrumental method that's going to lead to more equitable or more resilient smart cities. Instead, I'm going to try to get us to think about how we might question the smartness of smart cities and what sort of critical questions we might ask that can inform us how to think about these kinds of efforts towards resilience. And I'm going to try to push us outside of our boxes and think about smart cities in a political economic framework. To do that, I want to start by noting that in the literature on smart cities, I've come across a number of themes. And there are 4 of them in particular that I want to draw upon. And in fact, let's focus. Before I do that, let me remind us about 2 nearly universal aspects of smart cities. The first is that smart cities are all about technology. In particular, smart cities are all about information and communication technology. This is, to many, what actually makes smart cities smart. The use of ICT comes with concerns surrounding privacy, as well as serious concerns around surveillance and policing. Nonetheless, it is this information communication technology that promises to make cities smart and work better for us. Second, smart cities generally embrace some sort of business-oriented or market-based development strategy. They're billed as good investments for the private sector, great opportunities for those who have capital to invest. Put another way, in a time with increasingly out-of-hand inequality, smart cities are billed as great opportunities for those who have a lot of money to make more money. And in a way, I think these 2 characteristics make smart cities an ideal case to think about the concepts of the sort of anti-politics of economics, and even more so, and what I'm going to get into, is the anti-politics of technology. Smart cities have embedded within them politics, and they have embedded within them values. The first sort of value framework that I see coming out of smart cities is this idea of efficiency. In the context of cities, focusing on efficiency is fundamentally a process of depoliticizing the conversation. It involves turning social inequality and turning powerlessness into a question of management, into a question of technological challenges. More fundamentally, when we cite efficiency as a benefit of smart cities, when we talk about optimizing our urban spaces in order to make them more efficient, we rarely ask the question, for whom are these smart cities becoming more efficient? Whose lives are made more efficient? And whose lives are rendered stupid in the future smart city? A second value that comes up in the literature on smart cities is this idea that we are optimizing our practices. And this is straight in line with what it means to be resilient, is to not be wasteful and to use our resources efficiently and to optimize the use of resources. And here I turn to the work of Tanya Lee in her book, The Will to Improve. And she writes, the claim to expertise in optimizing the lives of others is a claim to power. She argues that claiming to optimize people's lives is a very audacious thing to claim. It's like me claiming I'm going to come into your house and rearrange your furniture for you in the way it should be done. I'm going to optimize the arrangement of your house. But this is a way of taking trusteeship over others, claiming to know what is best for others, asserting that we know how to make other lives better because we know what is best for others. And I would take this even further and argue that within these kinds of claims is really deeply embedded a form of patriarchy. Patriarchy over the poor and patriarchy over the marginalized. One where we in positions of social and political power can assert what is best for the poor and the marginalized and force those understandings upon them. A third value deeply embedded within the smart city framework is this idea of convenience. And while we may all like the idea of convenience, it doesn't take much to acknowledge that convenience comes at a cost, that there is always a price to pay, and who or what pays that price, and who decides if that price is okay to pay. We can unpack our focus on convenience in a different register as well. In a recent article in the Harvard Business Review, while arguing that engaging with the humanities is a crucially important thing for all of us to do if we want to take an ethical approach to our work, Gianpiero Petriglieri challenges us to question the value of convenience. He asks, what if inconvenience and discomfort, boredom and distractions are features and not bugs of a good life? And I love this quote, and I think about sometimes when I think about resilience, I think about something that's cutting edge, that is sophisticated, that is fast moving, and that's what enables it to be resilient. And Petriglieri sort of puts me on my back foot, because he's almost challenged us to think, what if to be resilient, we actually have to deal with inconvenience and discomfort? We have to deal with empty space for boredom and distractions. What if it is not just a project to be conquered and executed, and instead it requires us to have sort of a buffer zone around us that's not always taking us in some singular direction? Smart cities also promise to be safe. By now, we should all know the relationship between supposedly smart algorithms, security, and racialized oppression. Whether it's the marking of Black and Brown and immigrant neighborhoods as high risk due to algorithmic crime prediction, a form of modern redlining and place-based exclusion, or the profiling of dark-skinned men as threats through facial recognition software, I find myself asking the question, are our efforts to build a smart city really, in practice, efforts to build a white city, or effectively an anti-Black city? Is that what we're doing in practice, using the tools which we have created? If we're interested in resilience, if we're interested in resilience in a justice-based manner, we can't look the other way here. And this is not just the future, this is in fact the present. Within all of this, smart cities are all about data. And some would call this idea that we're going to make our decisions in our urban frameworks using data a sort of neoliberal fantasy, an extension of the fantasy that our reliance on economic markets will absolve us from having to make political decisions. And this is where I find this anti-politics of technology and the anti-politics of markets equally sort of intertwined and complicit with one another. Again, in the 70s, the dominant economic ideology of the time led us to let go of this idea of equitable redistribution through the state. And instead, we turned to markets to decide who gets wealthy and who doesn't. In doing so, we empowered financiers, those who we now not so affectionately call the 1%. Today, I think even more than markets, it's our reliance on technology. That is where our future utopian city lies, brought to us through market actors that promises to make decisions for us. Decisions, we are told, will be made based upon data. If you don't like the decisions, blame the data. No one is responsible. This was a data-based decision. There are no politics to be seen here. And of course, this is ridiculous, but the lure of eliminating politics is deeply seductive, particularly in our moment right now when it feels like everyone is too busy fighting. Politics is about disagreement, and the promise of expert-led solutions is that we need not have such disagreement. Instead, we can have a sort of techno fix out of our social problem. This approach to politics is fundamentally anti-equity. Over and over, we see examples of how algorithm and data discipline the poor and reproduce the social injustices that we struggle with today. And I think we can do better. We can work to create democratic cities where people disagree and argue, but they do so as a process of working together to create the future they want. This, I think, lies at the core of what it means to build resilience. And this leads me to the concept of the right to the city, an idea derived from the work of French urbanist Henri Lefebvre. For Lefebvre, the right to the city is an assertion of use value over exchange value. For example, the assertion of the right to housing over the right to property. This is something that's happening even in Venice today, with the entire Occupy Venice movement that's asserting that people's right to rent out the property they own to tourists is not as important as local residents' right to housing. Urban theorists have taken these ideas even further. They see the right to the city as a broad right. Imagine as the right to participate in the city and in urban life, as a right to reform and refashion the city in ways in which we see fit. We live in a society, writes geographer David Harvey, in which the inalienable rights to private property and the profit rate trump any other conception of inalienable rights you can think of. Our society is dominated, he writes, by the accumulation of wealth through market exchange. If we care about resilience and we care about equity in our frameworks of resilience, we might do well to adopt such a right-based framework in our work and to assert a right to the city that is, as Harvey writes, not merely a right of access to what the property speculators and state planners define, but an active right to make the city different, to shape it more in accord with our heart's desire, and to remake ourselves thereby in a different image. If our urban world has been imagined, then it can be reimagined and remade. I would be derelict to talk about cities and to talk about urban spaces and to talk about this idea of whose efficiency, whose life is to be optimized, who is granted convenience, who is safe, who has the right to the city, while not also acknowledging the city I am in right now. I am zooming into you from UC Berkeley. I'm standing on unceded indigenous land. The land I'm standing on is Ohlone land. It is land that was taken from the Ohlone people following a series of massacres that were committed by the United States. Most now refer to these massacres as an act of genocide. To have a conversation about smart cities and resilient cities and just cities and the right to the city cannot happen without starting with and including those whose land we occupy. And I realize the context here is different depending on the land you're on, but this may be inconvenient and it will certainly be a complicated conversation, but I struggled to understand how we can think about resilience while ignoring the concept of justice and the injustices that lie at the very foundation of our ability to even have this conversation. In my case, there is no UC Berkeley without this first act of injustice. And I think this is true for every single city in the United States. And there are threads of this that exist for cities throughout the world. So how do we move from smart cities to thinking about our cities? And in that way, to thinking about cities that are more resilient, more inclusive, and more just. I think there are three pieces here that may help us to move towards resilience that we would benefit from considering when we think about resilience. I think too often when we think about resilience, we are looking forward and we fail to look back. And I think resilience requires us first to rectify historical injustices. As the common protest saying goes, no justice, no peace. And if resilience requires us to live at peace, then we have to think about justice. And we have to think about how we might make up for past practices that have resulted in the current inequities we live with today. This opens up a conversation for things like reparations or affirmative actions to rectify the historical trajectories based on injustices, whether that be injustices of the sorts of genocide at the root of the creation of the country I live in, or the colonial injustices, or the economic injustices that are ongoing today. I think we need to look at the history that created the present we live in before we can think about how to move forward. Second, I think we need to look at the world in a relational way. And given what Michael said right before me, this perhaps will not be particularly novel, but we need to think about our place in that relationality. Where do we sit in the world and how are we positioned in relation to others? Instead of thinking about poverty, we need to think about marginalization. And we need to think about the exclusion of others from society. Instead of thinking about the privileges that we have, we need to think about the forms of oppression upon which our privileges are built. Finally, I think to move forward and try to build resilience, we must start by centering the voices of those who have the least access to resilience. We need to think about centering the voices of those who are most marginalized among us. Rather than making this a power-led, expert-led discourse, I think it needs to be a discourse where the most marginalized groups in society sit at the front of the table, rather than are dragged behind in a continued position of marginalization. To do all of this will not be simple. To do all of this will require us to engage in epistemological transformation, i.e., we are going to have to change the forms of knowledge that we value. We are going to have to move beyond positivist, quantitative, empirical ways of understanding the world. These are methods that dominate my own discipline of engineering and really dominate the academy today. And I think we're going to have to move beyond those ways of seeing and knowing the world and start inviting other ways of seeing and knowing into our practices. And this epistemological transformation will have very practical implications. It will result in us asking new questions and different questions. It will result in us using different methods to answer those questions. It will result in changes to the things we teach and the things we study. It will even change how we teach the things we teach. And it result in us changing how and where we do our work, who we work for, who resilience is really about, and who we are accountable to in our efforts to create a more resilient world. In conclusion, I'm going to fall back on the words of someone much wiser than me, words spoken long ago. Dr. Martin Luther King said, "We must rapidly begin the shift from a thing-oriented society to a person-oriented society. When machines and computers, profit motives, and property rights are considered more important than people, the giant triplets of racism, extreme materialism, and militarism are incapable of being conquered." I would interpret this today in the context of what we're saying as, to the extent that we see resilience as a thing-oriented problem, as a problem of environment, as a problem of technology, as a problem of economy, we're going to miss the point. In fact, we're not only going to miss the point, but we're going to feed the problems of marginalization in society. We're going to feed the problems of militarism in society. And I think to the extent we can start seeing resilience as fundamentally a people issue and consider what it means to bring people together in peace with one another, then I think we may have a chance of moving towards resilience. That's what I have for you in terms of presentation. I have a few discussion questions that I have thrown up here that I'm happy to share. Flora, I believe I was supposed to have sent those to you and I neglected to ahead of time. So I can share them here or whatever you think is best, or in the chat box, whatever makes sense.
Khaled, first of all, many thanks for this really brilliant intro to what I labeled systemic resilience. And this is more than just systemic, what we are talking about, but also some needed ethical perspectives if we want to become really resilient. It's a question, as you had it, it's a question of human beings and of mindsets in the end, and not of technique or any kind of other organizational architectures or measures we are taking. I would be very interested in the thoughts and questions you prepared for our discussion coming now.
Yeah, the two questions I had for those in the audience. First is to, I'm speaking from the perspective of someone who's trained as an engineer. And I feel like I can understand how struggles over power are hidden within my own practices of my own discipline. But I'm curious to understand, how does politics, how does struggles over power show up in the work of others? Or does it? Or does the work of others turn into the work of technique? Or does it turn into the work of objects? And I'm curious if folks are able / willing to share how power in politics does or doesn't show up in their disciplines, in their fields, or in their work. And the second question is when we consider the world we live in, that is filled with these sort of individualist, market-based ideologies, and not just ideologies, but even structures that reward these individualist tendencies. And this is married to a sort of techno-utopianism, i.e., don't worry about the climate, we'll fix it with carbon capture. You can just continue chasing your own individualist goals to increase the size of your castle. I'm curious what reflections others have on how we may remain more rooted in our social relations and in our social connections with one another.
Oh, can you hear me all right? Yeah, thank you again, Khalid. That was a brilliant presentation. And yeah, I think this idea of resilience not being all fast moving, but getting us to really sit and think and feel a bit uncomfortable about what it means, and the kind of rethinking and the work we're going to have to do is really important. And I think on that second point, I think it's difficult, isn't it? Because now that everything's shifted online, especially within the past couple of years because of the pandemic, it's difficult to think about that relationship and how we're going to actually have to adapt now, going back now as things get back to normal. It'll be interesting. Does anyone have any thoughts on that? I'm just looking in the chat.
I threw the questions in the chat to help so that folks can see them there. Brilliant. As well.
That's helpful. Oh, yeah, we got them on our screen as well. Does anyone have any immediate thoughts? And if anyone wants to unmute and speak, that's absolutely fine. Or you can throw something into the chat.
If I may be so bold, given having taught quite a bit on Zoom in the past year and a half, this is very much related to the second question. This is perhaps not only how might we remain more rooted in our social relationships, but how might we be more present together with one another? This is increasingly a challenge to the extent our lives are mediated through technology.
Okay, yeah, this is a very good question also in my eyes. And this Zoom meeting we have today is an epitome for this. No? how we can become more social without being labeled as unrealistic or utopian dreamers or things like that. The life, when life also in line of your discussion and relating us to the second question, for me, the second question is the most important one. What to do with communities and thoughts and concept about communities and resilience in a world which in this very neoliberal socio-cultural ecosystem, encompassing ecosystem we are living in, is against community in the end, and emphasizing the individual consume of the world as an application for me, the consumer. How to do it with society is a first step. And the second step related to it, how to do with community, because we need a society and a feeling and understanding for a society first, before we can talk about community and a feeling and understanding about communities. And thirdly, we can speak about resilient communities in the end, so to say, after we pass this logical chain of realignment, the social issue, that man, in the word of Aristoteles, as a zoon politikon, as a political animal, becomes a social animal again. I wanted to open up explicitly the discussion on this point, because it's, in my eyes, as mentioned, it is crucial for the entire discussion we are leading today.
One of the challenges I think we have in regards to that, Ulrich, is without a sense of history, it's hard to understand that it need not be this way. Sometimes this just feels like the only way the world is and the only way it can be. And so how might we understand that, first, that history, and this gets at that David Harvey quote, that the world we live in was created, which means it can be created differently. So how might we get beyond the world as we see it to live in a world differently? I think that first requires to understand that this isn't the world, capital T, capital W, but this is actually a social and political creation that has put us in the situation we're in.
It's a very essential aspect, history. Let me pinpoint it in a bit provocative way. The recent mindset of seemingly liberated individuals ready to consume the world, this very mindset is against history, because history has also to do with modesty, with confinement, with an acknowledgement that I am not an omnipotent creative individual, but that I'm standing in the line of a context of development over a longer time. And consume does not need history. Consume is just an eternal present, a present state of being, of a seeming omnipotence of the consumer. And this relates to, also in my eyes, this relates to what Michael introduced as the relation between resilience and imagination. It's a question of imagination also, as we are speaking about history. If I imagine myself as a quasi-omnipotent, liberated individual, ready for consuming the world, I do not need any other imaginations than my personal ones occurring in the moment, which means I only have to consider as imagination my wishes and the sequence of my wishes. And I do not have to care about history. History is something for historians or some nice touristic places I can consume if I decide to do so. For instance, going to Venice, then I consume history in a large museum in the open air, but it does not really touch me. It is consumed as any other consumed. History is for academics and historians.
Yeah. And this is that point that Wendy Brown was saying about how Homo politicus is the is the agent that governs themselves and governs together with others. And there's both sides to that. There's, to what extent do we govern our own selves, or to what extent are we just driven by our appetites and desires in the moment as though we exist independent of everyone else? And to the extent we no longer know how to govern ourselves and put limits on ourselves in our own way of interacting with one another, then we no longer know how to be civil with one another. And what possibility do we have to live together and govern together in that moment?
I think the interesting thing with imagination is that unless you're already pushed or you have to do something, you know, like with the pandemic, we were pushed to go online because, well, we had to, but you know, that's something that people take at their own pace. So what is the incentive for people to imagine if you're not already inclined to do it?
But we can also say that we were not well prepared for doing this. And I think imagination and foresight, it takes practice. You actually have to teach people to, as I said, think more, be able to think in different paths of development. And of course, that takes time and investment, and also a place and maybe a group or other people to discuss those perspectives with. And I think that is nothing that society invests much effort and money and into, because then people will demand different things.
Totally. And then it gets messier and complicated. So why would we want to go down that road, right?
Yes. And what you said also regarding what I feel in my work is where politics influence what I do is, for example, when I write a research application, they already ask for the result before I even done the research, because they want to know how to measure this, what the outcome would be. And of course, I understand it. If I'm going to play around with public money, they want to know if it's worth it. But I think it's very contradictory in relation to both art and to research, that you demand an answer beforehand. And then we cannot develop these lateral or other perspective on our sort of place here on Earth, because we are not allowed.
Yeah, we're too busy going in a straight line to a predetermined destination. How can we possibly go anywhere else? Totally. Yeah.
Look.
Oh, Chris, do you think, I'm not sure if it's maybe just a mic thing. Yeah.
Okay, and let me answer to this point, related again to imagination. That is one-way imagination, which is in fact a reactive imagination, also in terms of consume that Khalid addressed. If I can imagine only, let's say as a kind, a bit overemphasized, as a kind of primitive organism, I can only imagine to some inputs I get in terms of what I have to consume now, what I have to do now for my own benefit, whatever this benefit might be in my perception. And then this is what I want to call it, a reactive imagination. And the true imagination in the direction of a desired true resilience, true means here in terms of mindset, as for real communities, means real resilience. A true imagination works very different. And then I have to leave for true imagination, I have to leave the system first, which I am in now. I have to conceive a total different perspective. And if it is not possible due to the systemic resilient aspects Michael mentioned in this very good example of this research application, if we already know what we have to do, then we can quit with research altogether. And this is an epitome of an entire situation I wanted to introduce as a systemic resilience. It's a systemic force. It's a systemic entanglement, getting like these self-making autopoietic systems, getting more and more momentum and getting more and more stable. It develops a resilience of its own, in other words. And this is our real life. This is no theory. This is the real life we are all embedded in now.
Well, we've also got a comment from Dr. Dennis Nietzsche in the chat. He says, from a city administration perspective, what Michael mentioned is crucial. How can I educate citizens to be able to really live the right of cities instead of being a mere object, technological or economic facts? I think that's so true. I don't know if, Khalid, if you want to say something on that.
You know, as someone who spends most of his time as an educator, I feel clueless on how to answer that question. You know, the challenge that I feel when you write that is related to what Michael said, and it's that the speed and pace of our lives feels like it's moving so fast, it's hard to slow down and recognize what may come that we don't already see a straight line towards. So at some level, I think about how might we slow down? And it goes back to that quote by Petriglieri about how might we introduce distraction and maybe boredom into spaces such that we may find their creativity and imagination that is not there otherwise. And I think at some level, we're moving so fast and in such an individualistic way, it's hard to find the space for that. On the other side, I worry that the complexity of the worlds we live in is so much more intense than ever before. The speed at which the technology is and the economy is shifting, it's how do we, I had a student the other day and he's Swiss, and he said, he explained the sort of direct democratic process in Switzerland. And he said, I don't really know what I'm voting on all the time. It's very complicated. I'm not trained in that space. And it does open up this question of what do we do in a world that's more complicated than our cognitive ability / time enables us to engage with? I'm not sure I have a good answer for that.
I think it's true. I think people switch off, don't they? If they don't know much about something, they just think, oh, well, someone else will sort that out, or someone, you know, they shift the responsibility without maybe even realizing it. But yeah, maybe Michael, do you have any anything to add to that about educating people on that?
Well, I think there is I'm struggling with this in some of the projects I'm dealing with, because I live in Sweden, and we have regulation about how to involve the public and so on into these processes. But most processes is about, since we are a representative democracy, most involvement is about informing what already have been decided for the people. So when they come to hear what has been decided, they cannot influence anything. But during the last 2 years, there has grown an awareness about, if we want to engage people more in society and democratic development, maybe we need to find ways and processes to sort of involve people before the decisions are taken. And they are really also, they're saying, we need to do this. We need to deepen this dialogue because it's crucial. Because people organize maybe in one way when they make their vote, but they organize differently in specific questions. And of course, this will create, if we get more messy. But I think thinking, as you said, Khalid, with this, you have to struggle a bit. There has to be friction. You have to learn about that is not a straight line forward. You have to negotiate. You have to work on your rhetoric skills as well. And we are actually not demanded, but we are encouraged to set actually set these processes, to start these kind of processes. But it's early, I haven't done it yet, but we are working in a project with exactly this. And it's so interesting to interview and talk to people on all these different levels, and to sort of take out these different experience and perspectives that are so different and so rich of both narrowness in how you perceive and look at other people, but also of the possibilities that maybe the politician does not see, because they don't, there are no surfaces for them to meet these people.
You know, which that's a fascinating point, and it gets really to Dr. Dennis's question a little bit about, we need to create surfaces for people to meet at some level. From a structural sort of urban perspective, how might we facilitate the meeting of people? And I don't just mean in a literal physical way, some sort of modernist project of interaction between the other and the self, but I mean that in a way of like across attending to the differences in power. How do we introduce, you know, how do we enable a citizen 50 generations native to this place to a recent immigrant and have them really meet and build community together? I think that requires, for sure, the physical interaction, but also an attentiveness to the power differences and the different conceptions of the world, and a mediation of that process.
I think that's a very interesting domain, and not just a topic. It's an entire domain. It relates to architecture, to the built space architecture, first of all, and in the foreground, but also to the invisible part of architecture. Architecture is a mode of organization. And if we conceive architecture as the deliberately put mode of organization opposed to self-organizing processes, then the question is, in terms of resilience and resilient communities, first of all, how these architectures, these organizational architectures shall look like in terms of facilitating these very interactions you mentioned, Khalid. It's a different domain, as said, but I think it's also an important domain as when we're speaking about the momentum of the existing systemic resilience.
We'll all become urbanists before we know it.
Good point. Are there any other questions, comments? I think it's an interesting point, and I'm desperately waiting for some other inputs, comments, questions.
Can I say some more stuff? I think also we should be very clear with that some of these changes and some of these processes take time. We are working with a community of gardeners who lives in small apartments, but they are 50 of them. They have a part in the city here. And it took them 8 years of negotiating with the local government to get this lot where they can. And most people would have gone away in week 3, because this was not what they imagined, that this will take such a long time. And of course, this is built into democracy, that they are slow, they are slow movers in that sense, because they have to defend themselves against fast-moving, strong forces, of course. And there you have all these layers of decisions that has to be taken. But on the other hand, I think it's important when people are involved or when they are engaged, that they actually can actually feel that they have made a difference, that they have actually what they have in the time they have invested should result in something for them. Because there are so many creative city workshops everywhere where people come, you post-it notes and all of that, and then you go away and the politicians feel fine and nothing happens. And I think that is wasteful, and that is not how to engage people.
And you know, I find some of my greatest hopes in efforts that are started from the perspective of the people who want to be engaged themselves. And I think about the example of the city of Richmond here in California, where there's an old greenway that used to be a railroad track. It was converted to a green space, but this is one of the poorest areas of the entire Bay Area, and it was totally like a trash dump and a really poorly taken care of space. And the community that lives really close to this greenway came together on their own and held, these are completely non-experts. They held design workshops over how should we make this space. They held events to bring people together to think about how to create the space. It took them as a community 3 years just to set up agreements on how they'll work together before they started doing the work, because they had to go through so much stickiness. Then when they drew up these plans, they sent them to some landscape architects. The landscape architects came back with a cookie cutter design for a park. And they said, no, we wanted you to do what we drew for you, just make it look nice. And it took 3 rounds, and eventually the lead architect came and said, are you serious? And they said, we're absolutely serious. We involved everybody for weeks, and it's a space unlike any other, because you feel the people in that space. Even if it doesn't fit some technical model of the right way to flow traffic, you understand there's something else going on there, and there's a deep beauty in that.
I think it's also a very important aspect. The spontaneity is making up the action of the community, and this is again to do with imagination, as just to address the issues we tackled so far. And the point Michael mentioned, as this we experienced in our hometown, we experience it very often. That this, I call it pseudo participation. So if people have to bring their ideas of an already made thing, this is this very same effect as the research results have to be fixed when I'm applying for the research procedure. And in Italy, they say this is a commedia dell'arte, you know, so we do so as if we would participate and if we would really introduce as the affected, as a means the inhabitants of an area, for instance, in a process. And I think the difficult point is in this positive example you mentioned, Khalid. The difficult thing is how these real innovative movements and real, in a good sense of communitarian, how these real communitarian, community-oriented moves can find their place in a system architecture which has no place for them, in fact, despite it is an official commedia dell'arte participation, of course. But if you want to really participate for a real resilience, what to do then? Huh? So except in finding the niches you mentioned.
At some level, like I hear you asking, like, are we trapped in the cracks and fissures of a larger structure and stuck operating in those spaces, or might we somehow exist beyond that and not always be trapped in these dominant frames and structures that seem overwhelming to us?
I'm thinking about, just to relate to your point, Khalid, at the moment, I'm thinking about the slow moving that Michael was addressing here. If this slow moving actually is a feature of democracy as some kind of defense against some immediate extremist forces and so on, and how to distinguish between this commedia dell'arte from Ulrich, this pseudo, it's moving slowly, but it's moving and you can participate, and this kind of moving slowly and it's actually moving. How to distinguish between these two directions at the moment. And on another another thought about this isn't this the fast result, isn't the expectation of a fast result also some kind of neoliberal idea that I have an impact and then I have to see the immediate result from my impact and so on. And maybe we have to train people actually to be somehow bored, as you said, Khalid, that this kind of boring feature has to be inscribed into our education.
Love it. I love it. Absolutely. It also makes me wonder about the differences in, you know, albeit somewhat stereotypical, but like urban and rural life, and the speed of the urban pace and the differences of rural pacings, and how we may be undermining ourselves in that not constant speed, and unable to see some things, and unable to see some of the wisdoms that come from other spaces as a result. Yeah.
Khalid, in my understanding, you're a civil engineer, right? So you were talking about this boring spaces. How could a boring space look like that it's not dystopian? It's a thought. You were talking about this boring spaces, and it immediately catches into my expertise. But it's, from my perspective, a boring place was always a dystopian place. But you were totally right, it isn't. So, but I cannot imagine, and now we are back to imagination and so on, how a boring but enabling space could look like.
You know, I think that's an interesting question. And I think it need not be boring, all concrete and empty. I think it may mean boring in the language of sort of the modern meaning of excitement. And what I mean by that is like a large park with, quote, nothing in it, but is actually filled with richness, is on the face of it very boring. You know, it's not like a video game with constant nonstop stimulation. It's actually like you have to sit with the place in order to be stimulated. It doesn't come to you without that patience. You know, I think about like sitting in nature. As you move through, nature runs away from you. You're a predator. But if you sit, suddenly things come to you in a different way. And so those spaces are boring to the untrained eye, and yet, of course, filled with richness. So maybe boring is the wrong word, but I mean boring in the sort of techno-utopian versions of the world in that sense.
I like it a lot. Thank you very much. Very nice.
People, are there any other comments, ideas, thoughts? It's a crucial issue we are speaking about now, no? And
there's one other thing about boring that comes to mind for me, and it has to do with our intergenerational connections. Sitting with old people is labeled as boring. How upside down is a world where we think that way? That is the inverse of every traditional society that has ever existed, that sitting with old people is a boring waste of time. And that has robbed us of the kind of wisdom that only comes with age, right? And I think this is a major problem. We're looking for a kind of stimulation that is actually lacks wisdom, depth, and the kind of beauty that comes in other ways.
Also, a very good point as regards slowness, no? And culture needs time and place to unfold. And first of all, also time on a place to unfold. This is this history point in a practical sense. As an example here, as we are here in Venice, the Venetian culture couldn't have come up in an age of neoliberal capitalism, where all the cafes look all alike, where you have McDonald's and so on and so on. they made an individualist difference. This is a unique city that needed time over centuries, in this case, to unfold it all. Or your example of walking in nature, you have to sit in the park and then nature is coming to you. If you are moving all the time, it will run away, right? And I think this is symptomatic for this, and this is Andy's question, in my eyes. This is symptomatic also for this neoliberal context we are in, and the influence on our daily mindsets, also not just on our daily practical life conditions, forming the architectural, the organization of our daily lives, but our mindsets, first of all. If we have no time, we cannot realize anything.
Yeah.
No, I think what we could do now is, if there are no more points from our participants or any questions anyone has, we could take a 5-minute break potentially, and we'll let Khalid go, and thank him enormously for joining us and his fantastic presentation. I think it's opened up a lot of points, and we're going to carry on after the break thinking about the imagination utopia. So thank you again, and hope to see you soon.
Thanks for having me. I'm off to bed soon.
Thank you very much. This was really inspiring, Khalid. Ciao.
See you.
Great. So yes, we'll take a 5-minute break. Anyone here in Venice who'd like to join us, please do take a seat. I'm just going to also invite you all to send us a message on any of our social media platforms. We've got Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. I'm just about to share my screen where you'll be able to see. Here we go. Oh, sorry. Go through that. There we go. So as you can see, coming up after the break, we'll have a presentation from Alessandro Scarfi from the Warburg Institute on resilience and utopia. But in the meantime, please do send us a message, add the hashtag ISWG workshop. Tell us a bit more about how you experience resilience in your community. So see you in 5 minutes. So I make that about, let's say, 22. Yeah, 22. Okay, brilliant. All right, see you in a second.